Everybody, my name's Rob Wormald. I'm a developer advocate on the Angular team at Google. If you look at your schedule, my talk title is something like Enterprise Angular. Sorry, this is not what that talk is about. Surprise. So, what are we actually going to talk about? So, just before we get started here, as Brad said this morning, we had this cool new labs thing. This is even more labs than the thing you heard this morning. This wasn't even talked about this morning. This is actually the first time we're going to publicly talk about this new thing at all. So you guys are the first, which will be pretty cool. So a little bit of background before we dive into this. So for me, Angular is, at this point, getting to the point where we are really, really good, I feel like, at building applications, right? The things that most of you are building on your day-to-day jobs. We're pretty good at this, right? We have things to improve. We have a lot of work to do on various different things. But in general, I think Angular has come together for the case that most people are using it for. We're pretty good at this. And this is our bread and butter, right? This is why we get paid at Google to build applications like this. But it can be challenging to use Angular outside of this kind of model that we all know, right? So rather than the sort of single-page app model where Angular owns the entire DOM, there are a bunch of other places you might want to use it. There are a bunch of other ways, to do stuff on the web. And so things like enhancing existing HTML pages. So this is what AngularJS used to do, right? You would write HTML, and then you'd sort of bootstrap Angular. It would read all of your HTML and kind of enhance it and make it magical, right? And you could do that just by adding that little ng app tag, little ng app attribute, right? And people loved that. That was great. It had some drawbacks, obviously, things like compiler performance. We didn't get good error messages, things like that. But this is a nice thing, and I think we may have lost a little bit of that in the new version of Angular, right? And of course, not just AngularJS developers hear about this, but anybody who's used Angular at all, anybody who is coming from other parts of the web, right? Angular and single-page apps in general are a little bit special in the sense that they own the DOM, right? You put an Angular component on the page, and basically, Angular owns everything inside of that tag, right? So this works well for big applications. Other things that are hard, like building CMSs, right? These cases where you might have some server-side logic that constructs a different page for if you WordPress or Drupal or anything like these. All of these programs, all they really do is lay out HTML, right? And then when the application boots up, it kind of starts up and gets interactive. This is not easy to do in Angular today. It's possible, right? But it's hard, and I'll get into that in just a second. And importantly, to use Angular components in sort of a non-Angular context, like a CMS page, you have to know a lot about Angular, right? You have to understand how it works. You have to understand the component model. You have to understand modules. You have to understand bootstrapping. There's kind of a lot of overhead here, right? And we have this case actually on the Angular IO docs, and we'll dive a little bit deeper into this. But we have a very similar case on the Angular documentation. It's mostly content, right? It's not interactive. It's mostly text. And so actually on the Angular IO website, if you've never dug into the code, what we actually do is the sort of outer shell of Angular IO is an Angular application. But all of the documents, all of the actual documentation, it's just HTML. And we sort of fetch that HTML, and we kind of just insert it into the page. But of course, that has interactivity in it, and we'll get into that. Other things. So there are a lot of cases, like when AngularJS started 5+ years ago, we were kind of the big player on the web, right? Everybody's using Angular or something like Angular. But in this day and age, right, there's a huge community of JavaScript frameworks. Like us, there's AngularJS, people who are upgrading. You've got people who are using React and Polymer and jQuery. We have this joke that there's a new JavaScript framework every 5 minutes. Good example of that, right? And so again, Angular is sort of hard to, or can be difficult to interop in these environments, right? You might have a big React application. I said React on stage in an Angular conference. You might have a big React application, right? But you want to use an Angular component. You might have some team who's building Angular applications, Angular components. You want to wire them together. You might be building vanilla DOM applications, right? There's a variety of different cases you could use Angular. It's a little more difficult than it should be. And we have this question inside of Google, too, right? Inside of Google, we have 3 or 4 big frameworks, tons of different teams building different kinds of cases. And some of them are building these big, kind of big enterprise applications. But some of them are not. Some of them want to do crazy things. Some want to have applications where other teams can load other functionality into these applications. Again, these things are all possible, but it's not sort of easy to do. I'll give you a little cool example here of something. So this is a team new to Google. This is a component that's actually written in Angular kind of in this outer page, right? It's got logic. It talks to a backend server. This is a sentiment analysis API, so I can say, hello, this is amazing. And I'll say, this is sort of, 0.1% toxic, whereas if I sent something like, this is terrible, if I can spell the word terrible, it'll give me a much worse rating. So this is kind of like a widget, right? You want to embed in some other page. Maybe you're YouTube, and you want to do this kind of analysis in your page. Maybe the team who's writing this component is using Angular. This is actually an Angular component. So again, this is a case where you want to use Angular technology, but sort of out of the kind of larger Angular context. Let's see if I can make my slides full screen again. Anybody? Cool. We'll go back to this Angular I/O demo. So this is the Angular I/O documentation. Sort of the outside shell, as I said, the nav bar, the nav down the side. This is all Angular logic. Oops. But the vast majority of the content here, right, is just static HTML. And then we have this kind of widget, if you like. This is a tab panel. This is written in Angular, right? So it's got a bunch of Angular logic. And so really what we want to do is load in this HTML that's not an Angular component, just static HTML, and then kind of bootstrap this widget into it, right? So we actually do this today. You can poke around while I'm talking about this. This is on the Angular main repo. These are a bunch of widgets that are written in Angular, and they run in this kind of larger application context. So there's sort of a live example. We've got API docs, code links, things like these are all little Angular widgets that run in a larger context. Looks like this kind of live example, right? Takes the name, the Plunker ID, whether it's going to be embedded, whatever. So you can kind of configure these little widgets. And this is kind of the public API to that component. The problem is that if you actually look at the code, right, it's not quite that simple, because what you have to do is take this kind of static block of HTML, go find all of the elements you want to sort of enhance, right, and then kind of plug Angular into them. You have to say to Angular, take this component and kind of connect it to this existing piece of HTML. So again, possible, but this is written by us, and you can see us asking questions like, why can't I do this thing, right? So it's not simple. It's not trivial. Of course, you've got to plug in things like change detection to this case, right? You've got to handle each time context changes somewhere else. You've got to kind of manually wire up, manually wire up the change detector. When it destroys, right, you've got to be sure you don't memory leak. You've got to do all your cleaning up. And so again, there's a lot of kind of manual management here. It's not super easy. So summary, right? Angular components are tough to use outside of Angular templates, and even more so out of Angular applications, right? This is something we'd like to get better at. Let's take a little bit of a detour here. So raise your hand if you've heard of web components. For the record, that's most of you in the room. Raise your hand if you've ever used a web component. For the record, that's like 10 of you, right? Raise your hand if you've written a web component. There's like 2 people on the Angular team and 2 other people, right? So not many, okay? But they've been around a long time. Let's just do a little dive in them here. So people like to talk about web components. I actually like to say there's no such thing as a web component. There's no spec for web components. Web components are made up of these 4 specs. So on the left, they're HTML templates. This is the template tag. We don't use this directly in Angular, but the ng template that Alex just talked about is kind of very conceptually similar. Shadow DOM, we do use this in Angular. You know this as view encapsulation.native. This is using the Shadow DOM API under the hood. HTML imports, Polymer used these. They've actually backed off of these. It looks like HTML imports are not going to kind of get implemented in the rest of browsers, so we can kind of imagine HTML imports is dead. And then custom elements. This is the really interesting thing, and this is the part of the web component spec that we don't use today in Angular, right? So these 2 that we do, templates and Shadow DOM, HTML elements are going away, and custom elements are kind of the big part of web components. And custom elements are pretty simple. What they allow you to do is basically define what we know as a web component, right? So it allows you to take some class, some bit of logic, and turn it into a proper HTML element, right? So it acts like any other DOM element on the page. So there was a v0 back in the early days of Angular. We looked into actually implementing Angular with this. It wasn't really possible. There were some APIs that didn't fit. There's a new v1. It's been out, I don't know, 18 months or so. It's got some really cool new stuff that actually makes it really useful for Angular. It's already shipped in Chrome. I believe it actually is shipped in the proper Safari now. If not, it's in the tech preview that should be out in the next release of Safari. We can polyfill back this to IE10. Nice, the Angular team doesn't have to polyfill this because the Chrome team polyfills this, so we don't have to worry about that. So custom elements, right? You want to build a custom element, and you want to be able to use it like this. Now, if you look, this looks a lot like what your Angular page looks like, so keep that in mind. So we can take an HTML tag, we put it on the page, and the idea is that you write a class, so we have this fancy date picker. Note that it extends from HTML element, right? We're taking a subclass of HTML elements, and then we register it with this custom elements API. So this is part of the browser spec now. If you go into Chrome and start typing in your console, you'll see this pop up. And you say define, use this selector here on the left, and then hand it the class that you want to sort of act as the element, right? And then you can just put it on the page, and it works. It just starts up and starts doing stuff. They have some important APIs. 3 APIs. So the first one is attributes, right? So you've all used attributes before. Attributes are the things you see in the HTML. So custom elements have the ability to listen for attributes changing, and they have a lifecycle hook that kind of plugs in and kind of gives you a notification when that happens, right? So you can just say, I want to listen to the current date and give me a callback when it changes. So in the HTML, you can use like this, right? You can just put it in the DOM and add the actual attribute. You don't have to do any code writing. Or you can do it imperatively in code, right? So you can query for this thing, set some attribute on it. Properties work the same. So fancy date picker, right, has a setter and a getter we're going to do here. So when that property gets set on that element, we'll do something like update the DOM, vice versa for current date. And then, of course, you can do the same thing, imperatively in code as well. Note the difference here between doing current date as current date, which is camel case, versus the non-camel case version of the attribute, right? So keep that in mind. So properties we can set really easily. And then events, right? So custom elements can emit events, like native DOM elements emit events. So we can create a new custom event here, do a date change, and say this dispatch event. And then, again, you can query for it and add event listener. And so this should look very familiar to you as web developers, right? This is how the web works. This is what's nice about custom elements, is they're not any different from any other HTML elements. You already know how they work, pretty much. They also have lifecycle hooks, right? So connected callback, disconnected callback, those fire when the component gets, or the element gets inserted or removed from the DOM. Attribute change callback we talked about, and then adopted callback, which I couldn't actually explain to you if I had 30 minutes, so we'll just skip over that one. And then, of course, one thing that you may or may not know is that custom elements already work in Angular, right? This is by design. This is not a coincidence. You can take a fancy input that you've defined, put it in your Angular template, and again, use the standard Angular templating syntax, attributes, properties, events, right, to communicate with this element. Good so far? Questions, comments? This is web components, right? So great, let's just do everything this way. Why do we need a framework, right? What's the point? I'm going to get in trouble for probably saying this, right? But let's just do everything as web components. Well, so the Chrome team at Google has been working on a set of sort of how-to reference components. URLs in the bottom right there. You can go look it up and kind of dig around. So this is a very, very simple component, right? I believe this is like a fancy checkbox. And so this is just the connected callback, right? So we're doing those like if checking and setting attributes and keeping things in sync. Ditto for when the attribute changes, right? We got to do all this imperative code to check and see what are we doing. Can we remove this attribute? There's a lot of stuff to keep in sync. It keeps going, right? This is when the property gets set. We have to reflect to the attribute. There's a lot of work here, right? I just want to point out somewhere in here, if you see the word reentrancy and a dot comment, right? It's probably not something you'll be able to write by hand. It's not a trivial thing to think about, that word reentrancy. Cool. And of course, this is Brad's favorite slide, right? This is all the other stuff that Angular does, and none of this stuff is part of web components. None of this stuff is part of custom elements, right? So you have to kind of fill in this gap in the middle. Anybody see where I'm going with this yet? So Angular elements, this is the new labs project. And the basic idea is that an Angular element is simply an Angular component packaged as a custom element. Very simple concept, but it opens up a really cool bunch of things. So the first is there's self-bootstrapping. It means you can just put them on the page and they'll start themselves up. You don't have to call like bootstrap, you don't have to query for them. You just put them on the page and they start up. Basically, they just host an Angular component inside of a DOM element. And again, this is already how it works in Angular. You know about host listeners, host bindings. You're talking to a real native element. And so in this context, we're just going to use that custom element as our hosts. And then we just bridge between these DOM APIs, that is the properties, the attributes, the events, and the Angular APIs you already know, right? At input, at output, we're just going to kind of connect the dots. And of course, like I said, host bindings, host listeners, they work together. Zones are optional. If you haven't been paying attention to our repo in v5, zones actually become optional. So this opens up some really, really interesting new cases. It makes it much, much nicer to integrate an Angular component into an application that's not using zones, older applications, whatever. Again, it's an Angular component on the inside, but it's standards on the outside. It's this web component custom element on the outside. And importantly, very importantly, this means that anyone can use it, right? You don't have to know anything about how Angular works. You have an Angular developer who writes a component, writes an awesome date picker, spits it out, and then anybody on any team in the company outside can just use it because they already know how it works. It's a DOM element. It doesn't do anything special. So just for a quick comparison, I'm going to show you an actual demo of this in a second. This is a progress bar written as a native HTML element. You can tell up there in the top left, top right, at the top, that is extending from HTML element, right? And then we've got our lifecycle hooks. We've got setters and getters and all of these things. This doesn't look all that strange, right? But note that I'm doing things like having to manually set attributes, right, and keep things in sync and do getting of attributes, et cetera. So native implementation of a progress bar. This is the Angular implementation of the exact same progress bar, right? So if you squint, again, it shouldn't look that different, but it's an Angular component, it's a progress bar, it's got a template, it's got some styles. Now, we've got our inputs, right? So this is that progress value that we're talking about. Notice that we don't have to do any kind of crazy setting and getting of attributes because we already have a thing that handles reflecting state to DOM, right? So this host binding on line 21 there, that will keep the DOM value in sync, right? So when the progress changes, it will go ahead and update the ARIA value. Compare that to having to do it in the sort of long-handed version I was showing you a second ago. Let's go back to the beginning of this. There we go. It's much, much cleaner, right? Really what you're doing is describing the view as you do, and a very declarative syntax for how I want to get data into this thing, how I want to get data out of this thing, right? So I'll show you a quick demo of how this works. Right, so very small progress bar here. I'll just say what the code for this looks like. I have a very, very simple set of code here. Can you see this? Probably not. There we go. That progress bar really making progress? So very simple ng progress bar, right? You can see it reflecting the value here as it changes to the DOM. It's keeping that in sync for me automatically. It's got a shadow root, so this is using native shadow DOM. And inside of that shadow DOM, right, the actual kind of logic of the component is happening. So again, this is not that kind of interesting until you see, how do I use this thing? How do I play with this thing? What if I want to use this in a different context? So let me give you a couple of ideas how this works. So very simply, I'm just in my console. You could do this in code for real. I'm going to basically do let L is document.querySelector. I could spell the word selector. And I'm going to say query from my ng progress bar. So now I should get my L out. Cool. And now I can do things. I can just say like cool L dot progress equals 55. And it'll set it, right? Or I can do L dot progress. It'll log for me the current value, right? So this is on the page, and I can interact with it. Works like a regular DOM element. But what if I want to do something more interesting, right? So I actually want to create a new one of these progress bars on the page. I can just do this. And again, this is not Angular. I'm not inside of Angular. I'm not doing anything. I'm just in the browser console here. I can say progress bar. So now I get the constructor, right? Now I have a handle on the actual progress bar constructor, and I can just do this. I can say let p is a new progress bar. I get a copy of it, p, and I can say the progress is 50. And then I can just say documents.body.append child. Put my p in the page, and it works. That's the response I was looking for, right? So compare this to that code we looked at before, which is you have to know all of this stuff about how Angular works, how it all connects together. You don't have to know anything about it. This is a simple DOM element. Anybody who knows how to use the web knows how to use this already. This is cool, right? So a couple of things to show you on here. Cool. So again, same deal here. Simple application. I can say document dot. I can even say document dot body dot. Actually, let's do query. Don't actually remember what I called this. I believe it's hello world. Yep, cool. So I can do that. I can just go in here and I can say, right, literally in the HTML directly, if I can actually get to the HTML directly, I can just change this in the DOM, and it will keep it in sync. And again, I can do the same thing, but L dot name. Make sense? Cool. So what we're doing here is these are like widgets, right? These are very simple widgets that aren't really doing it. It's like one component. This is a nice case, but we can take it a little bit further, right? So what if we go And don't yell at me on the styling on this one. But now we could we take an entire application and do the exact same thing. So this is where the enterprise case comes in, right? You have teams who are building widgets, little units of business functionality. You can package them up as a custom element and put on the page. Same rules apply here, right? So again, this is just a to-do app on the page. I can say let to-do app. Go ahead and get that constructor. Just a note, if this was going to load asynchronously or had some loading mechanism, I can also use when defined. And it will say to me, or will give me a promise of when this is available for me to use it. I'm not going to use it here. So now I can literally just create to-do apps all day long. So I can say let, new to-do app. So I have two on the page, and just to show you that they are independent of each other, right? So new to-do text. Adds there, doesn't add there. So these are two of the same applications, so two distinct instances, distinct injectors, distinct platforms. Gives you really, really, really nice reusability. So, get back to my slides here. This is, as I said, really, really early stage. We've got a PR that's about to land for this. We are pretty confident this is a pretty cool approach. We're not sure what we're going to do in the long term with this. We think this is a very good idea. I think as even I've been working on this over the past kind of couple of months, it's brought up a whole bunch of really interesting questions, a whole bunch of really, really interesting new ideas. But in general, we think that this is going to be a really useful model for a lot of different cases. As I said, CMSs, widgets, whatever you want to do, this makes the whole thing significantly more flexible. And just to close the loop, because I want to show you this, because I built it the other day, and this is the first time I've ever written a Preact app. I'm going to say Preact on stage at an Angular conference, right? So if you haven't seen Preact before, it works just like React. We've got a little simple demo. It's got a constructor. It's got some lifecycle stuff. And it's this weird kind of JSX syntax down here, right? Now, you can see, though, inside of that JSX, I'm returning my ng progress bar. This is the thing we were just playing with on the other page. I'm passing in the progress as a prop. This is the React or Preact term for it, state.progress, and it just works, right? The component doesn't have to know anything about what the actual Angular element is doing. So I think I'm probably out of time. As a new idea, this is something we think is pretty cool. I think there's a huge amount of cases for all the enterprise folks in the room. I'll be here for the rest of the conference. Come and chat with me if you have ideas or concerns or whatever. I'd love to chat with you about it. Thanks for listening.